Hey everybody. I hope y'all are doing well. Again, I'm Diamond Ray from the Syllabus Cohort. I'm going to be discussing Beloved Part 2 today. So we're really getting in the thick of just the awesomeness that is this book. Jouelzy will be joining us in a little bit. But yeah, feel free to put in the chat as we start up any thoughts, feelings you have at this section of the book, but also anything you need to process. I feel like this was like a heavier version, or not version, just a time of me reading it, because there was a time that I read sections of this book years ago, and it's a little bit heavier now. And I don't know if that's because of what's going on in the world or anything of that nature. But yeah, and if you want to become an insider and have access to the syllabus and syllabi that we use for our general track and complex track reads for the book club, visit smartbrowngirl.com and you'll be able to get that. And there's also a link to that in this description. So I'm going to just look at the syllabus and start at the section 2 questions, and I'll be monitoring the chat, everything of that nature. So if you have any questions that you want to process and have us answer as a group, I will share that. And yeah, so part 2. So that was chapters 19 to 25. So in part 2, concerns about Seth's and Denver's isolation are a point of contention and concern. So community members are offended by Seth, and at that same time, Seth feels abandoned by them. Seth becomes even more concerned with Beloved and withdrawn into maintaining a life at 124. And so in this section, we learn about Seth's memories at Sweet Home, during which school teacher beat slaves for thinking for themselves and treated them like animals. Seth recalls the sexual violence and death perpetrated against Black mothers during slavery and explains her reasons for killing Beloved. The role of daughters and sisterhood is also explored through the chapters in the section along with the intergenerational nature of trauma. So this has been, it was a heavy section for sure. And I appreciate this question. How does Seth's obsession with Beloved escalate in this section of the novel? So how does Seth's obsession with Beloved escalate in this section of the novel? And I think one of the more powerful parts, thinking of intergenerational trauma and slavery, it's so heavy, right? Because when I think about it, it's also understanding the fact that at this point, there were so many mental disorders, illnesses, and things that, for all intents and purposes, didn't exist yet, right? So what is therapy to a slave? What is healing after experiencing constant daily trauma? What is healing for Seth after she literally had her breast milk stolen from her, right? So the idea of being a mother but not choosing your motherhood is one that I don't think is often thought about first when we think about enslaved women. And what does it mean to have agency? And one part that I think about with the trauma and its intergenerational nature is how Baby Suggs, she really kind of interrupted that by talking to Denver. And this is mentioned in the section of part 2, where Denver was talking about how Baby Suggs introduced the idea of kind of loving and pleasure and just making sure that as enslaved people, they really had that as something that they should really pay attention to, and intentionally, just because there were so many things that they didn't have the opportunity to enjoy about themselves and their bodies because it was being sold. And even and also with on the subject of the ownership of bodies, Paul D, we learned so much more about him in this section, and just the hard life that he's had, that all of them had. He found out his price, he said. He found out that his life was worth less than someone like Seth's because she had the ability to reproduce life. And that all the things that he could fix, and as tall as he was and as big as he was, it really wasn't that much compared to a woman. And he was kind of thinking about his importance in that way. So I think that was pretty interesting. So y'all let me know your thoughts. I think there's a lag with the comments because usually I see some by this point, but it's okay if y'all don't have any. But I'm going to repeat the question for the folks who just joined. We're on the awesome syllabus for Beloved, and it says, how does Seth's obsession with Beloved escalate in this section of the novel? And I think the way that Toni Morrison writes and shares how obsessive all the women, I think, in the family were with each other in a way was pretty interesting. Denver is obsessed with Beloved because she doesn't want to lose Seth. Beloved's obsessed with Seth because she doesn't want to be abandoned again, killed again, left alone again. And I think loss, abandonment, and reclaiming of ownership in life is one of those themes that constantly repeats through this point. So yeah, and again, if y'all want to reference what I'm reading these questions from, again, that will be on smartbrowngirl.com. The link is in the description. So the next question we have, how does school teacher epitomize the dehumanizing qualities of chattel slavery? So I think that all of the white characters discussed in Beloved, the book as a whole, there's such a contrast between the lives that they live and then the people that they buy as slaves. And even the nuance of some masters and slave owners who were seen as more nice because they kept the nuclear families of the slaves they owned together, that seemed very striking as well. Mr. Garner and Mrs. Garner, they were seen as not that bad compared to other slave masters. And even Paul D was amazed to understand and know that there was a family that Baby Suggs had. She knew her children and there was a history with them. And anytime that he traveled and met other slaves along his way to freedom, he was amazed and always was asking them, you know, who is your mom? Who's her sister? How did y'all get here? And I think that really, really highlights how important knowing where you come from is and has always been in the Black community. So someone has commented, I guess it's a lag, but I do see this on Facebook. So Joe Pugh says, school teacher just sounds like a harsh person. I agree. So I'm going to show that. School teacher is definitely a harsh person. And even when I believe it was Paul D in his voice, he was describing that school teacher ate less, he slept less than a lot of the enslaved. So he was just a harsh person, you know. He was crotchety. He ran a tight ship, if you will. And that was even worsened, I believe, after Baby Suggs left. And it's interesting to think of hierarchies of cruelty and slavery, but that was a thing. Being enslaved was a part of their whole lives, which I think, again, is a death that we aren't taught in schools. And even we discuss with each other as people of color, as Black people. And I think that this section of Beloved gave me a little bit more of an intimate understanding of that existence as enslaved folks during this point. So thank you for that comment. All right, so I'm going to move down. So what does school teacher represent in Seth's memory of Sweet Home? How does this differ from Mr. Garner. So, what do we think school teacher represents in Seth's memory of Sweet Home? I believe that Seth just sees school teacher as someone who made life harder, honestly, and an already not ideal life in existence. Whatever hardships that existed in the beginning before he got to be his harsh self, that, really is what Seth has in her rememory of her life there. Not only did he make life harsh, but he was a pivotal person, and the displacement and the disjoining of her family unit, right? And I'm pretty sure we don't know too much about Seth's genealogy or who she's with, and anybody can correct me if I'm wrong, but when she got to know Baby Suggs and she got to know who these folks were and really be with somebody's son, which is how it's described, is when she had that relationship with Holly and what that represented to her, being with somebody's son. School teacher was a major, major component of the displacement and the breaking up of that family. And by the end of section 2, we learned that Paul D was there when Sixo was shot and killed while they were escaping to freedom. So school teacher was there for it all. So I think, if anything, he represents the harshness, but also displacement and breaking up of the family bond that she cared about so much, which in a way is kind of how she dealt with seeing him come. And when she killed Beloved, he was the figure. He was one of the horsemen that arrived to take her back to slavery and enslavement and being away and hidden and not around this amazing family that was full of love and happiness. So we have someone who said, school teachers just seemed methodical. Methodical. I'm going to show this one. School teacher was a real life devil for Seth and her loved one. He was basically the reason for everything going left. Right. He, without him, Beloved might be still alive, and that's not to say Seth isn't guilty for killing Beloved, right? But would that have happened on that day? The misery, which is what Stamp Paid called it that day. Would that have happened if school teacher wasn't there? So I agree. He was a devil. And the heaven and the happiness that existed before the misery occurred. So I agree with that. And if we could talk about that, how do we think that school teacher and Mr. Garner are different? In my head, this really is just a textbook example of like the two white individuals or different positions in white supremacy, right? There's the one who's very active in the killing and the disenfranchising in the horrors of it all, right? The saying of the N-word, the not really respecting people as people. However, I think Mr. Garner represents that, in a way, present tense, neoliberal acquiescence to, well, bad things are happening to these people. I'm just kind of going with the motions. I'm subscribing to this in this capitalist society to get to what I need or how I want to live. But I can still respect some people as people. And again, y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that Garner, he did make the differentiation at some points of respecting Paul D and the men in the family and on the plantation as actual men, if I'm not mistaken. So we have someone says that she totally agrees that she wouldn't have killed Beloved if he didn't show up. Seth saw him as the end of the family. Right. So we have this figure who essentially is the person who ended all that she knew and enjoyed and loved about her family. And I think that was very pivotal to her killing Beloved. When she saw him there at 124, which is where I believe the killing of Beloved happened. Sometimes I think the timeline and places, I get lost in it at moments. So I believe that was at 124 when she killed Beloved. When Tony writes, was the 5 horsemen and school teacher was there. And for that image of him, it was haunting and terrifying enough for her to see that image of school teacher, to the point that she had made that decision right then and there to slit her child's throat, right? So the horrific effects of this one man and his sight in what she called home at that point, after escaping slavery, going through a makeshift birth on a boat with the aid of a random white woman on her way to freedom. She did all that to have this man come to her home, where she had all of this love and life flowing at that point in comparison to afterwards. And just the thought of him and seeing him was enough for her to say, I don't want Beloved to go through this. And I think it's powerful, just as tragic and awful as it is to think that someone would do that and have that agency, because that was what it was. As a woman who is enslaved, you don't own your body. You don't own what goes in your body. You're not even in control of who is taking the milk that is made for the babies inside of you for other people, right? So there is so little agency that an enslaved woman has, that like seeing and having to make the choice and the ability to make that choice was probably something that not only rocked Beloved and made her come back, but everyone around her. Because at that point, Denver was also thinking to herself, well, if Seth is my mother and she's capable of killing my sister, how safe am I? And I think that's what the missing part for the last discussion that I had, because Jouelzy had read forward and I read Denver's obsession with Seth as an obsession. She's just afraid of abandonment. But what's also in there is that Denver at this point is low-key afraid that her mother is also capable of killing her, even though she's much older than Beloved was when she was killed. There's always something in the back of her mind, and knowing that her mother is capable of murdering her own child, right? And she's not, because Denver can't perceive of that, she has an unrelenting fear of what could possibly happen next, right? So we have someone else says, Mr. Garner was complacent. He's like a Democrat, and school teacher was a Republican. Right. I was getting like the opposing neoliberal white positions that are so prevalent today. They were both terrible, but one showed his beastliness more. Right. And I often see this dichotomy set up between folks who talk about the type of racism that is experienced in different parts of the world, obviously, but also in the US, since I am American myself. And kind of like some Northern Black folks are like, oh yeah, I would never go to the South because they're super racist down there. When I have Southern friends who are like, well, it's racist, but it's not that different. At least you know where people stand if it's more in your face in the South. In the North, you don't know who it is. Like, who voted for Trump? Everyone was crying. Who voted for him then? Like, we just don't know, right? So I think that's something that a lot of people of color and Black folks understand, that you don't really know who's around you. And if they had the opportunity to really show their true colors as far as the racial hierarchy and whether they should submit to that or would like to implement it if they could, who really would if they had the opportunity. And I think that school teacher and Mr. Garner are definitely emblematic of those two different types of white people in society today. Yes, in the Toni Morrison doc, she said this woman was anything but a victim. The children were hers, and she could do whatever she wanted with them. It's a powerful and stiflingly scary act of love. So I don't know if y'all were present for this point of the book club, but we had discussed all about love. And I'm not going to derail the conversation to that too much. But what, thinking about an act of love and the expression of love, I thought that back in section 1, or part 1 rather, when the idea and the picture of the clearing was being painted by Toni, and how Baby Suggs would gather everyone there, and people would be crying and people would be laughing, and just the willingness to show and really sit with the emotions of their lives as enslaved people was extremely powerful. And I felt that through the pages as I was reading it, which makes a lot of sense now, understanding that when Baby Suggs passed, a lot had changed as far as energy and people wanting to be around 124. Without her there, they didn't want to, right? So I think that was very, very telling, and maybe a result of Baby Suggs being able to be a mother figure to Seth, to say, practice your agency, experience love, experience pleasure. What can you do? Experience it if you can, right? So yeah, I definitely agree. And I did watch Toni Morrison's documentary. I believe it was on Hulu. Brilliant, amazing documentary. I'm forgetting the part that you mentioned, but thank you for offering that to the space, because it is an act of love. And not being able to have agency over the children you have, what you do with the milk for those children, not even being able to name your own child after you birthed it, right? I was on Twitter, and one of the viral tweets was, I know for a fact that slavery was 100 times worse than what we know from reading and the history recorded, right? And I think we all know that, but it's something that's unsaid, because we're grateful to not be in those times, especially me, because I'm pretty sure if I was born at that time, I would have been there, and I would have been in the fields. I'm one of those. So it's something, the lack of agency that Seth and these enslaved women had at this point in history, I can't fathom it. Like, I'm still processing it. And the agency needed to say, I'm not going to let my little girl go through this. I'm going to slit her throat, and I'm going to be okay with that. Because Seth didn't seem apologetic from what I read. It seemed like everyone else was sorry for her. Like, they didn't want to come visit her. How could she? Even Denver, when the boy at school had asked her if her mother had really done it, she didn't want to think about it. So I think in the back of all these people's minds is, how could a mother do this? And it was never something that was truly confronted. Even Seth's relationship with Paul D added to that. He just kind of left. He was gone. And that's all it took. But I think that there is some type of unwavering strength about Seth, and a certainty and the agency that she did have. I don't see her as apologetic. I don't know. Do y'all think she was apologetic? I didn't get that from her at all. But thank you for offering that, Arjumand. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, but that was great. All right. So next question we have: what is the role and impact of history and memory in Seth's life, or as Seth likes to say it, rememory? What is the role of memory in this? I think this was a heavy section. I don't know. The first section the first part of the book was obviously heavy. It had more in it. But this second part was heavy in a different way, and I'm not sure if I know how to articulate that, but there was a lot of trauma discussed, and we got to name the trauma because we heard that trauma from the victims of it in their own words, right? We had that section that was talking from Seth's point of view. So Seth's chapter, we had Denver's, and And then we had Beloveds, which, and I'm assuming this was Beloved, unless it was just a standalone chapter, but even the way that the text was written, there was a disjointedness about Beloved. And even still, she wanted to make sure that she had a relationship with Seth regardless. And I think that calls attention to the nature of motherhood, the nature of Black motherhood through trauma, intergenerational trauma, and not wanting to remember things. The whole part from Seth's point of view had to do with her realizing that Beloved was the physical manifestation of the baby she had killed, right? We had that scene where they're having fun. They were ice skating. They were sitting by the fire with their blankets. It was a very beautiful moment, a much needed break between the trauma discussed. And in that, we have Seth realizing that Beloved is beloved because of a song that she hums, right? She says, I only sung that to my babies. And then the light is finally going off in Seth's head. And I think there is a type of shedding of trauma that goes that Seth experiences in this moment. She's in her head. She's saying, well, I don't have to explain why I did it. She knows we can be happy now. I don't have to do this. I don't have to remember this because I don't need to tell her because she understands, because she wants to be with me now. So we gotta get first row of seats to what's happening in Seth's brain, kind of realizing, wow, she came back and she understands why I killed her. Which is just, this book is like mind-shattering to say the least, as a Black woman. And I think it was a healing thing when Seth heard that song that Beloved was humming. So that was really beautiful. But the memories, what do memories give us? I think if we use our memories correctly, we can heal the trauma. We can acknowledge what was learned through these experiences. But because, again, these are enslaved people who have to survive, we're not talking about folks who are living and thriving, free and liberated, right? Because even when they were liberated, as was discussed, there are moments of still realizing that they're not like the white people that they serve. And there was a point where Seth was in her head thinking about taking ingredients from where she worked home because she was cooking all day, and how she had to think twice about taking these ingredients that were left over and technically stealing. But like the dialogue in her brain was just like, well, I don't want to be outside with the other Black people waiting for the supplies and ingredients. And it was a pride thing for her, right? And she didn't feel comfortable with having that pride, which is crazy to think about, even practicing her agency and bringing food and ingredients home from her place of work. She still felt bad, but not enough to go wait out in the cold for the ingredients with the rest of the Black people because she worked there. So even when she had reached this point of liberation and she's an ex-con and she's working, there's still trauma happening everywhere she turns, at home, at work. So these memories, the way that they manifest, is still in survival mode for her and all the characters, all the Black characters in the book. So we have someone says, Seth was always trying not to remember many moments. She'd keep busy to make sure her mind wouldn't go certain places. I think she was apologetic when she realized Beloved didn't understand at all. So you think that Seth was apologetic at a particular moment, and that was when she realized who Beloved was. Interesting. I really didn't get the sense that Seth, well, I could see her being apologetic in her head, but I think that the dialogue, her inner dialogue with herself, the result of that was her kind of saying, this is okay. We can move forward. We don't need to go back there because of the trauma. I think her relationship with Beloved at this point, it was more like a clean slate in her head, even though she did have all those inner feelings of, oh, should I tell her this? I don't have to remember this. I don't have to remember this. The feeling that I got by the end of that section was, she understands because she came back to me. And because Beloved came back to me, then she understands. But thank you. Because now Beloved was in her face and she couldn't not think of it. Once she realized Beloved was her daughter, there was no running. That's ultimately what drove her down. What do you mean by drove her down? You're right. There was no ignoring her killing Beloved. Because when she finally saw Beloved and realized who she was, she's here. But also, I think the fact that for the most part, Beloved definitely did choke her. And that happened in the clearing in the first part of the book. Beloved definitely did that. But at that moment, I think that Seth was honestly so happy that she was there and that she had come back, that she saw it as a past. So Boss Dog is saying, is this the same movie, Open Mate? Yes, this is. And thank you for joining. We're talking about the book that the movie was based on, which profiled an enslaved woman who escaped to freedom, who ended up killing a child of hers when she was being brought back for the Fugitive Slave Act, I believe, when they were able to go to free states and take back slaves. So when Seth was about to be taken back, she decided to kill her daughter, who was about 2 at the time. Memory can heal, but holds power to reopen the wound. Exactly. And I also think that there's power in naming and language. A lot of times things don't feel as real unless we say it to someone else or write it down. I'm one of those people, I try to journal, to process things, but I definitely think writing things down can be painful, because in a way you are reliving the trauma. It's not only in your head, and it works both ways, because now it's not in your head. So you have lifted that weight. And I definitely have spoken with people, and this idea of healing with other folks and lessening the burden of whatever you're carrying by sharing it with someone else, right? So now she didn't have to hide what she did from Beloved, because Beloved was staring at her, with her, smiling and happy to be there. So Elle says, I think she was unequivocal in her decision. I think her only regret was that she sent Beloved by herself. I think Seth felt relieved and Beloved returned so that she could explain. Let me read that again. I think her only regret was that she sent Beloved by herself. I think Seth felt relieved that Beloved returned. Yeah, I agree. I didn't get much of a apologetic sense from her. It was more so I can finally exhale knowing that this baby, my baby, wants to be near me after I murdered her. Like something that I think she genuinely buried behind her mind. Because if you can imagine, even when the story began, there are things rattling and handprints showing up in cakes. And for all intents and purposes, her being haunted by this child of hers that she killed. For her saying, I'm not running anymore, I'm going to live in this house, she wasn't participating in her rememory at that point. All of that was numb. And I agree with the other commenter who posted, she kept herself busy. And I think that wasn't as clear to me before. So I thank you for offering that. She definitely did keep herself busy. And I think when we talk about intergenerational trauma, how many Black people do you know, Black women do you know, who keep themselves busy these days so they don't have to sit with themselves or things that they might have gone through, because it is a lot. And I think in this capitalist white supremacist society, it's rewarded when you're burnt out. It's rewarded when you overwork yourself or are always available. And especially in the case of Black women, because a lot of how we and our identities are politicized is if we are not open, if we are not extroverted, if we're not smiling and inviting and willing to go the extra mile, we are seen as aggressive. We are seen as threatening. We are seen as people who don't deserve to take up the space that they're in. So I think this idea of keeping yourself busy is certainly something that's been passed down intergenerationally in the Black community, and specifically with Black women and womanhood. So taking up space to rest, I think that was one of the themes that I got from this, even though it was an interesting way that it happened and how she realized that was her daughter. I think that Seth was kind of exhaling at that moment. We have Beloved wanted to punish her, though. She loved Seth. When Seth tried to protect her in the front yard that day and Beloved left, Seth caved into herself. Paul D had to tell her she was her best thing. I'm trying to think of the moment you're talking about. She was trying to protect Beloved from who? Beloved left. Is this in section 2? Is this in another part of the book? I don't think I'm there yet. I think that was in the 3rd part. Yes, sir. So another person. I recommend you read the book Boss Dog, but was she a spirit and how did the baby live? Yeah, it was a baby who got killed, who became a spirit, who then manifested as I'm assuming 20-year-old-ish. All right, man, you spoiled it for me. No, it's okay. So OMG, I apologize. Yeah. So I guess Beloved does leave in the 3rd or 4th section. We're only on this is only part 2. So we will have 2 more lives discussing the last 2 parts of the book. But yeah, we could go in our last 10 minutes of this. Beloved recalls histories of the Middle Passage, slavery, and delivers a tantalizing monologue that gives more insight into both her and her mother, Seth. Legacies of the Middle Passage permeate the story as Beloved, now an ancestor, and her mother link present and future, instigating that contemporary Blackness is linked to the horrors of chattel slavery. Woo! This is heavy, and I appreciate this question. How does Beloved's memory give a voice to hopes and desires of other enslaved Black people? Wow. So how does Beloved's memory give a voice to hopes and desires of other enslaved Black people? I think that Beloved is a character. I say she's a little insidious, a little bit. She definitely wants to cause harm when she first shows up at 124, right? She's angry, she's upset, she doesn't want anyone else to be around her mother, who she has a significant beef with, right? And I want to thank Morgan and Dr. Nicole for this syllabus question, because I think it's really poignant and important. I think Beloved reached in her anger, in her rage, in her unhingedness. I think that's a type of freedom, right? We got to think about it. The freedom to feel certain emotions and express them. I can never imagine like being upset about something and not being able to express that verbally or even with your body or letting out a deep sigh. All of these things could have been met with violence or death or worse things, right? Because they can't really show their humanity as enslaved people who are treated as chattel. So Beloved has a type of freedom that I think she inherited from her mother. And although her mother and Baby Suggs were not blood related, I think Baby Suggs was very, very instrumental and making sure that the women around her and the people around her could feel what they wanted to feel, right? And not be apologetic for those things. Yes, I killed my child. I'm not apologetic because it was intentional. Yes, Beloved is angry and almost choked her mother out. Not apologetic. It was intentional. Intentionally feeling these things without having the fear of repercussion of this white supremacy that is just omnipresent everywhere around them. And just being able to exhale, let loose, even if that is a negative emotion that comes out when you're letting go. So I think Beloved represents in her freedom and how she's feeling, and she's dancing and she's humming and she has a face that she's not going to change to make people feel better. Like this idea of, hey, why aren't you smiling? Right? That so many women here, so many Black women here, there was a type of unapologetic energy that I think Beloved exhibited that was not afforded to those around her. And most likely because she did go to another dimension. She was killed. She came back. She showed up with brand new shoes. Just unexplainable, inexplicable things that were there when she showed up. I think that is emblematic of just how free Beloved was. And her mother set her free because she exhibited freedom and agency in that moment, right? So we have someone says, it goes back to intergenerational trauma, anger and wrath of what could have been and the horrors experienced. And it's all lost to history or the memories we are left with. Right. So thank you for commenting that. I don't know if as a community, as the Black community, the American descendants of slavery, we have been given a space to truly express anger or wrath or hurt or grief from the intergenerational trauma that has been experienced. Because I guess one thing that's lost on a lot of non-Black people, which kind of upsets me, because it's like there was slavery, right? And then there were the after slavery, the Black codes, the sharecropping, the chain gangs, the redlining, the Jim Crow, the discrimination, the everything like that would affect the quality of your life that happened after. Even in the fact that like folks got reparation for losing their slaves as property, and the Black people who are now free did not. I think that's lost on like most people who aren't American descendants of slavery, so they don't really understand just what the landscape of Black American life and the nature and nurture of it all is. When there was no time in history these traumas have been addressed in like a systematic, like what if like everyone was able to get free therapy? What would that look like? Because we don't have that freedom. Someone says, I think Beloved says it in the line, I need to find a place to be. All the ancestors find a place in the memories of future generations. All the ancestors find a place in the memories of future generations, right? And that kind of makes me think of something off subject, but like the movie Coco, and kind of thinking about how we remember people and that keeps them alive. But when you think of your life as just this one whole traumatic event of like trying to survive, how do you have and affirm your identity as something other than trauma, as something other than a problem, as something other than I just need to get through day to day? And I think there is a type of freedom that Beloved has in her life. So I'm going to go over one more question before we leave, since it's only 3 minutes left. It went by pretty quickly. So this is a quote from Seth. And it says, beloved, she my daughter, she mine. She had to be safe, and I put her where she would be. But my love was tough, and she back now. I knew she would be. I won't never let her go. How does this quotation from part 2 encapsulate Seth's struggle throughout the novel? I think, like most of the book and most of the characters in the book, Beloved is struggling with loss, or Seth, is struggling with working through abandonment, working through loss, working through trauma. And Baby Sucks and her family represented a family to her in love. And I think her losing people she knew, like Sixo and all the Pauls and Hallie, who I don't even know where Hallie is. Maybe we'll figure it out in the next section. But there's so much loss and so much violence and so much trauma. Now she has something to hold on to that existed, right? When you have ownership of a family member, or you have ownership, of someone who loves you and they're there and they're experiencing this trauma with you, I think that adds something. Like misery loves company. Well, you need other people to support you on your way. And I think that Beloved returning to her represented the returning of not just her daughter, but her making a decision out of her agency and out of love to kill her, and having her come back shows her that she made the right decision in her head, which I think is powerful to her. She had a decision to make, and she thought it was the best at that moment. And now she's able to still be with her baby and still not have school teacher take the baby away at this point. Which means she won. She beat the devil in this instance. Excuse me. This is the only thing the enslaved could hope for. They don't own their bodies or their babies, so they can only hope to have a life beyond, in the soul and in the memories of others. Wow. Yes, I completely agree with that. Let me share that. Yeah, and I think that's powerful. And it's the lie sold to a lot of slaves when we're talking about the Christianization of these Spanish colonial communities and in Americas. How was religion used? It was to say, just hold out, be a good slave. On the other side, you'll get what you need. You'll be happy. Whatever was said to make these folks complacent, which is why a lot of people have, or a lot of Black folks may have problems with Christianity today. I certainly do. For that fact, the fact that it was kind of utilized as a weapon to make sure that the enslaved, stayed complacent, and were peace be stealing until they were dead. So when you know you can live in others people's memories and your soul can go on past the constant pain of living in this unjust and traumatic and violent life that you have as someone who is constantly on the run and have to look over your shoulder because you might be returned to that violence. Dying and living on in others' memories isn't so bad, you know? At least I have a chance or the opportunity to imagine something other than what is here, right? So that's an awesome comment, y'all. So it is 6 o'clock, which means it's the end of part 2. Join us soon for a discussion to part 3. I think we're just having one more. Check on it. There should be at least one more discussion on the end of Beloved. Thank you all for joining and participating. I'm Diamond Ray. I'm a part of the Syllabus Cohort at Smart Brown Girls in their book club. And if you'd like to become an insider and have access to the syllabus for this book and all the others that we have used and will use moving forward, click the link in the description. Thanks, y'all. Have a beautiful night. Get your rest, and peace and light.